Hey, vinyl community, it's Mazzy here, and I'm in on the West Coast in Seattle, and I have Chris from Blues Guy Vinyl in Alberta. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Mazzy.
Nice hat, nice glasses, nice goatee.
There we go. There we go.
It is like
It's like
mirror
it's like
imaging.
a time warp mirror.
Yeah, you got the black hat, I have the white hat, so it's kind of like good guys, bad guys.
Yeah. Well, we get in Calgary, we get a lot of cowboys. We got to wear the hats.
I think a lot of us would rather be in Canada right now, personally, but okay, here's what we're doing today. We are doing, it's basically the folk blues revival of the 1960s.
Right.
And we're going to show about 10 records each, or 10 artists. There's a couple of artists that I have two things I'll show at the same time, because I want to kind of show a yin yang of that particular artist.
Sure. Yeah.
Obviously, we can't show a complete overview of folk music or blues because that's so vast, and with 10 albums, what are you going to do? What I want to do just a little introduction, what's leading into my interest, and then I want Chris to talk about him and his channel, and I'll put a link to his channel. A lot of blues, not all blues, but a lot of blues, and I learned a lot from Chris.
Yeah.
From Chris here. It's funny, the left and right, yin yang.
Yeah. It's weird. Yeah.
But I want to start with a collection. I only have on compact disc. Everything else is vinyl, and to me, this really pushed it and got a lot of the whole Greenwich Village scene and the American folk sing and the blues revival in America and around the world. And that's from the great archivist Harry Smith, and that's the American Folk Music, Anthology of American Folk Music. Harry Smith was an archivist, was a ethnomusicologist, a musicologist, and went around America doing field recordings in the blues, in the Delta, gospel singers, folk singers, all kinds of musicians, mountain, hillbilly music. And in 1952, put out a series of, I think it was 6 records that came out in 1952. Now, this came out coincidentally, I don't know, right exactly in the midst of an America of the Red Scare, the Communist Scare, McCarthy hearings and everything. So a lot of the music that I'm going to talk about on the folk side, probably a little more than the blues side, goes from the 50s into the 60s through the civil rights movement, since the commie left liberal scare, anti-war movement and beyond. But this is an essential set that a lot of the artists that I'm going to share were really turned on to and played music. And he really, and the other person is Alan Lomax, the archivist.
Right. Yes,
Alan
absolutely.
Lomax, who also did a lot of field recordings in the American folk song, some blues, but and rediscovered a lot of these people we all know now. And I'm sure Chris is going to talk about it. So that's my little intro. So take it away, Chris.
Well, thanks, and thank you, Mazzy, by the way, for inviting me and for hosting not only this one, but this whole series you've been doing. It's really great to chat with everybody face to face, to meet you live in person, if you will. And you have a beautiful city there in Seattle. I've been there a couple of times myself. I didn't feel really homesick in Seattle. It reminded me a lot of Calgary. The only difference is we do not have the ocean, but we have the mountains. We have something similar to the Space Needle. And it's a little bit of a smaller city, especially by American standards. We're only about 1.5 million people here. So it was really nice. I spent a week there doing the whole touristy thing, and it's a beautiful town. It was really great. And it didn't even rain that much.
So people are surprised how hot the summers are, because all they know here about is the rain. Hot summers, wet, cool winters, but not like Midwestern cool where it's
not like drifts of snow as up to the eyeballs.
Maybe
which we do get here.
Snow a year, if that. Yeah.
So hello, good people. So I like how you touched on these field recordings and Alan Lomax, Alan and John Lomax, John Work, a lot of these guys, and really for me with these folk music festivals, there was this sort of blues musician revival or rediscovery of a lot of these blues musicians. And there was sort of 3 categories. There was the sort of just post-war, and then there was the 50s, and then the 60s. And within those 3 categories, there were sort of 3 categories of artists too. There were new artists that were sort of coming up, And then there were these artists that were quite famous that they would often use as headliners to really put asses in the seats, if you will. And then there were artists that had recorded in the 20s or 30s or just pre-war that were seemingly vanished or disappeared, and then they were found and sort of brought back into the limelight. Mm-hmm. And sort of the first leg of that were guys like Leadbelly and Big Bill Broonzy and Josh White. So this is a nice little album that features just a couple of tracks from each of them. And each of those guys did a lot of recordings pre-war. And they were sort of that first wave in the late 40s, early 50s in that sort of folk music festival where they started bringing a lot of blues artists. Mind you, Leadbelly and Josh White, those two really weren't blues artists exclusively. They sort of referred to themselves as songsters. There you go.
Big fan. I'm a big fan of Josh White.
Yeah, and you know what? I just received some VCLT from Elliot.
I saw that. I have that record.
Yeah, great record. I've actually been spinning this nonstop. It's absolutely wonderful.
One of my all-time favorites. You'll get into it with your guys too. You're right. He's more of a folk artist. It sounds very folky, almost like the Muddy Waters folk singer record, which I didn't show. I don't know if you pulled it or not, which is to me one of the great sounding records early 60s. But
yeah, that's a beautiful
very
record.
folky. But these are folk blues in essence, and they're just wonderful records. One
really,
from the 50s, one from the early 60s.
Yeah, and really folk blues music is really a form of folk music anyways, really. I mean, you know, especially when you think of that sort of early sort of country or rural blues, right? It was anybody who could pick a guitar or blow a harmonica and had a half-decent voice. You know, they were performing for themselves, family members, maybe in these country juke joints and that sort of thing.
Well, the country music uses with that. It brings a more of a wider audience, whiter, I just put it in racial terms, but the blues tends to come from black artists, African Americans, and the whites really kind of gravitate to the folk. But there is a lot of crossover, as we all know.
Oh, absolutely. There were many white blues artists, and there were many African American quote folk artists like Josh White and Leadbelly, right? Big Bill Broonzy he doesn't get enough love. You know, he was a fantastic guitar picker, had a great voice, and he kept himself relevant through the 40s, 50s, and 60s through all sort of three of these different styles of folk music festivals. Big Bill is great.
He's great. Got a little more gravelly voice. I do have I have a couple of his LPs, but I also have a really great, I think it's a Big Bill Broonzy story that has a narration, sort of him talking about his life with him. I think it's a 2 or 3 CD set up here.
The funny thing is he was a bit of a charlatan, because when he was sort of presented during these folk festivals, he sort of billed himself as this Arkansas farmer with the denim coveralls and the straw hat. But prior to that, he had already been a very successful R&B artist in Chicago in the 30s and early 40s. He would just sort of managed to keep himself relevant by, you know, donning these different hats or masks.
So he dressed as the blues artist.
Exactly.
Central casting.
Earn that paycheck.
Hey, you know, all the power. Better to get it in your lifetime, like so many artists we know in blues and jazz, and you know, their paycheck comes after they're long gone. And sometimes their family doesn't even get any of the royalties or publishing on it. So that's right.
Or oftentimes they would record, and their contract would be a temporary contract where they would get paid cash money, $200 a side, which in the 30s or 40s was a lot of money. They get paid $200 cash per song. So they'd be in and out of the studio in 20 minutes, half an hour. They'd come in prepared. They would record, you know, at least 2 sides, but often 4 or 6 or 8 sides. They'd get their cash, and they wouldn't get paid again until they came back and recorded more sides. So yeah. So what else you got there?
Well, okay, I'm. What you just said will bring me to the artist after this, but I'm going back in time just because, again, it leads into the 60s, but it goes back literally to the Dust Bowl, and that obviously is Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody Guthrie, would we have Bob Dylan without Woody Guthrie? Would we have a lot of other people? Woody Guthrie traveled America, wrote a lot of songs during the Dust Bowl. 1940, RCA signed him. He was 27 years old and put out this album on, I think it's 2 or 3 records in 78s, Dust Bowl Ballads. A lot of songs we've heard recently. Obviously, you know that I'm a big Ry Cooder fan. A lot of this music
Yeah, me
I
too.
got turned on because of Ry Cooder, and I went back on it. And I'm the
Right.
generation in the 60s. I remember in school, one of the songs that we used to always sing, there used to be, folk music was big when I was in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. That was the folk revival, the American 60s folk revival,
Okay.
which I'll touch into it a little later what I got into. I didn't really get into the music personally a lot. And that whole music kind of was going from the late 50s into the early 60s until literally, on February 7th, the Beatles killed it in 1964 in a way, the
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
folk revival. Not exactly, but it seems to be like that. But This Land Is Your Land was a song that we used to sing in school all the time. It almost became like after the Pledge of Allegiance and America, God Save America, whatever, we'd sing This Land Is Your Land. But on here
Mhm.
is Talking Dust Bowl Blues, which Dylan obviously picked up on. Vigilante Man, another song, and Do Re Mi that Ry Cooder and many others covered. He wrote these during the Dust Bowl and just after that. RCA hired him. The interesting thing, RCA wanted a folk singer. Folk music was starting to happen
Mhm.
in the 40s. And because of, I think Columbia Records had Burl Ives, who was very, oh, the fox went out on a chilly night, very
Yeah,
upbeat. A lot of
yeah.
people of my generation and beyond know him as the narrator of the snowman in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer animation.
Right, right. Or
A
that
great,
song,
great
"Funny
singer.
Way of Laughing" and all that.
Exactly, great singer.
Yeah.
But this is an amazing record. And he wanted, when LP started coming up in the 50s and the 60s, he wanted RCA to put it out as an LP, and they wouldn't do it. So Folkways Records picked it up, and I don't think
Yeah.
they put it out as 10-inch records in 1950, and finally in 64 it came out as an LP, and this is that LP, a copy from 1954, but a beautiful photograph. Who took this one? Arthur Rothenstein, very reminiscent of the Dorothea Lange photographs of the Dust Bowl that she took.
Yeah, the Great Depression
Since I'm a
photos.
big
Yeah.
fan of photography and that historically, I think this is one of the most amazing covers. Also, a couple songs, a song called Tom Joad from the Steinbeck character book, Grapes of Wrath. And also Bruce
Yes.
Springsteen went on and kind of, reworked his versions of these
Yeah, and
characters.
Springsteen was hugely influenced by Woody Guthrie.
Exactly.
Woody
So,
Guthrie
I
really
mean,
was.
big inspiration. We all know he died of Parkinson's, and Dylan saw him in the hospital again in his early days.
He was really kind of one of the first working man's hero on record, like on recording.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. Kind of an everyman who was able to tell a great story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um, so I was talking about like some of the guys that seemingly disappeared and then were sort of brought back into the spotlight. And there was a lot of those guys that it seemed like even though they'd been gone for 20 or in some cases 30 years, didn't miss a step. They never lost their ability to play. They never lost their voices, and they never lost their ability to remember all the lyrics to their songs and really captivate a crowd. And a crowd favorite was always Skip James.
Uh,
Skip James was one of those guys that caught religion and kind of stepped away from the blues for a while. And he was sort of that generation that was brought out in the 50s, first of all, and then they brought him back in the 60s as well because he was such a huge hit. And just a wonderful voice, that sort of high falsetto, sort of a haunting voice, and a really great guitar picker. Again, not really bluesy, although he did bend a lot,
right.
but it wasn't that aggressive sort of percussive style of the Mississippi blues that we often think of. It was very melodic and just lots of beautiful, intricate phrasings and just very odd tunings and things that he would do with his guitar, where you listen to some of these earlier recordings or you watch some of the footage from these folk and blues festivals, and if you close your eyes, you would swear there was two guitar players,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just him and his playing. It was absolutely incredible.
You know, I got turned on to him, and this is a good example. And I didn't show any in this particular video. Maybe that's another one down the road. But the whole British blues revival of the British bands, everything from the Stones to the Yardbirds to even later Led Zeppelin. But
Sure, yeah, yeah.
I didn't know Skip James in the 60s, but the song that I got into him was I'm So Glad by Cream,
Right, yeah.
Cream's debut album in 1966. A
Yeah,
lot
and
of the
that
records
was,
I'm showing,
that's
I think
from this one.
I stop at 65, 66 when I'm showing, because in a way that's when the bluesy area I'm getting into sort of dissipating a little more to rock and roll and electric.
Right,
And I'm not by any means against electric or staying away from electric in this series of records. But Skip,
yeah.
but again, I got his music. It's like all those British bands turn me on to these other
Yeah, like who originally did that? Yeah, yeah.
Muddy Waters of the
I'm
world.
so glad it's on here. You know,
Yeah.
it's just a
Yeah.
wonderful song. You know, Cherry Ball Blues, Hard Luck Child, Devil Got My Woman. You know, just incredible stuff. And another guy that was thought to have disappeared and was sort of had to be coaxed back was by a gentleman who was also an archivist, and he ended up managing a lot of these guys. And you would probably recognize the name is Dick Waterman.
I've
And
heard you say, I don't know a lot about him, but
Dick Waterman sort of rediscovered Son House.
Okay.
And Son House was another guy who sort of caught religion and stepped away. And he got scared because a lot of his friends and fellow musicians were dropping like flies in the 30s. Robert Johnson died, Charlie Patton died, and they were all sort of living that hard blues musician lifestyle. You know, a lot of drinking, a lot of womanizing, a lot of partying, a lot of hoboing on trains from town to town. And he thought, oh man, I'm next. So he kind of backed off. And he was found up in upstate New York working as a porter for the railroads.
Wow.
And Dick Waterman convinced him to come back. And he didn't lose his voice, but he did have to sort of be reminded of a lot of his songs.
What a surprise. What a surprise. Another Jewish producer, a manager, bringing the artist in. I got a question. This is for, since we'd start with archival materials and the archivist and musicologist here. This is a personal question for our vinyl community. Son House.
Yes.
Do you organize Son House under S or H?
I organize them under H because House is his actual last name.
Oh, is it? Okay,
yeah,
there you go.
Son is his nickname. He's actually
like Sonny,
Son Jr.
Like Sonny Boy Williamson in a way. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I organize him under H. But Howlin' Wolf, I also organize under H because that's his stage name.
That's his stage name.
Chester
That's the kicker. That's a whole other video about
organizing. Yeah, that's
exactly. Okay, I'm going. You know, there is a thing in American folk music, and the record label, especially the larger labels, were really trying to capture the moment, capture folk music, but making it a little safer than some of it was for the pop sensibilities, for, you know, to make it cross America. To me, a lot of people don't consider this next artist I'm going to show as a traditional folk artist in terms of American folk music. But he was in New York in the early 50s, a struggling actor. And this is a thing on the other side. To pay money, because he couldn't make it as an actor, he decided to sing. And of course, he sings and he becomes a huge multi-million dollar seller for RCA Records, and that's Harry Belafonte.
Oh,
and wonderful. Harry Belafonte, this is his. This was a huge record, 1959 Carnegie Hall record, beautiful sounding record, but a folk artist. And obviously he popularized and it really pushed forward the whole Caribbean thing. I'm not showing here the typical records like Deo and Jamaica Farewell. But songs like John Henry, Cotton Fields, you know, again, Cotton Fields is one of those songs that years later, I got into that song because of Creedence Clearwater Revival, and then went then went back. Danny Boy, Irish, yeah, exactly. An amazing sound record. There's actually this is just a RCA 70s. This is a 70s pressing. I'm not getting into pressings on this particular video. There's amazing. I know Analog Productions did a audiophile version, but any good pressing of this, it's a gorgeous record. There's a volume 2 as well, but I go with this one. But for the sake of this video, the one I pulled that is from 1958 is Belafonte Sings the Blues. So this really crosses over, you know, between the folk and blues thing. And what a beautiful voice, beautiful man. And of course, he became a wonderful actor as a result of all this too. But and really big and in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement throughout the 60s. And again, that goes back to a lot of these artists. Not so much, he didn't get, I don't think, caught up in it as much, but a lot of Josh White was one who got screwed during the 50s, during the Red Scare, the communist thing. And a lot of these artists were blacklisted when they,
Yes.
did anti-war songs or songs about social injustice and everything.
Right.
So that's a big part of this whole story, whether you're talking about blues and folk music. But they just couldn't record on some of the major labels for a long time. But anyway,
which is a shame.
Because I couldn't talk about this without talking about Harry Belafonte.
Yeah. And really the roots of a lot of folk music, it goes and is the same as the roots to the blues. It's a lot of these work songs and field hollers and even what they call ring songs and children's songs and those sorts of things too, Right. Leadbelly was another guy who did children's songs. He released albums of kids' songs.
And did Woody Guthrie as well.
Yeah.
And one of my artists later, I should wait to say it, but Pete Seeger did as well. And that's an important one. The thing about it is, this isn't just confined to North America, this music. I mean, I'm taking it from that point of view. I think you are too, for the most part. There's a whole thing that I'm a big fan of the British folk singers, traditional Irish, traditional folk music that comes from Ireland and England, and Europe and everything. And obviously even, Southern European and Eastern European folk music, but that's a vast world that maybe someday we get into more of that stuff. I think I have on compact disc and vinyl anyway, but
there's a peppering of a lot of those Irish and English turn of the last century folk songs in what was sort of one of the foundational structures of the blues anyways, these sea shanty songs and that sort of thing.
Oh, Danny boy,
and it helped to give the early field hollers and work songs some structure, so they could sort of easily be sort of written down in notation and on sheet music, and end up eventually evolving into the proper 12-bar blues structure. And a lot of that does come from the UK and Ireland and Scotland as well. The old jigs and that sort of thing too.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I got a couple of more guys here that were thought to have faded away and then were brought back in the 50s, and a couple of them in the 60s. One of them is B.B. King's cousin, Bukka White, Booker Washington White, who completely different style than B.B. King, much more folky. He stayed much more in that Mississippi blues tradition. He played with a slide. He would play sort of guitar in the sort of the classical sense, but he would also often play it on his lap with a slide and play it very percussively. He could use anything as a slide, a bottleneck, a piece of wood, the back of a pocket knife, what have you. And very gruff, very aggressive style of singing, but very, very much a showman, which fit in perfectly with that sort of second wave of these folk festivals in the 50s, where, as you had mentioned, how in the 60s, the British invasion of rock and roll was really happening. Well, in the 50s, of course, American rock and roll and R&B to some extent for the African-American community, was really knocking down the blues. But because he was such a great showman and was really great with the crowd and was just sort of a larger-than-life personality, he managed to do quite a few of these folk festivals. And again, he was another one that sort of carried on from the 50s into the 60s.
There is that a crossover. That's why we couldn't talk about just the 60s folk blues revival without going back. I mean, back to the 40s even, and before that. What caused that? And it's very political. This music is political, especially. I mean, the blues is political, but I think the folk music is a little more political, and the blues is more social and personal. And but folk, a lot, not all, obviously. This is I hate to make one point that says everything.
Generally speaking,
yeah, but it protests outwards a lot. At least the white artists did, because they could get away with it. I hate to say it,
Absolutely, that's the way. And whereas African American artists, such as these old blues cats, they very much relied on double entendre to get the message sort of under the cover. So they, especially in the 50s and 60s, used a lot of jive talk and ebonics, for lack of a better term.
And the blues. There's a lot of sexuality in the blues.
Oh,
Definitely, you don't
absolutely.
hear
Yeah.
sexuality in the folk music very much. You know,
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
except when you get into later, well, I don't even know. Okay, I'm going with an artist again who got was huge recording artist on Vanguard and RCA Records in the 50s, and then and into the 60s beyond, and was right up on the civil rights movement, and that's Odetta.
Oh, yeah.
This is a great album. This recorded in 1960, Carnegie Hall, which another little double take on this. I didn't record here, but there's a folk artist from the Greenwich Village scene named Eric von Schmidt, who Dylan refers to and who actually did the painting of this cover on this album of Odetta.
Okay. Beautiful voice, by the
She
way.
did a lot of traditional folk songs, like If I Had a Hammer,
Mm-hmm.
When I Was a Girl, Gallows Pole, John Riley, John Henry. Those songs, again, I got into. John Riley's a song I got into because of the Byrds, the whole folk rock sing of the Byrds that went back in this. This record, I just pulled in just because this is a little later. This is probably not till 64, 65, but Odetta covering Dylan. That was a whole rash. Once Dylan really broke, and once Peter, Paul, and Mary, really pushed Dylan over the top, even though they had 2 or 3 records out. He had 2 or 3 records out before Peter, Paul, and Mary got together and did "Blown in the Wind." That really got Dylan, on. America really realized what his songs were, and a lot of artists started covering entire albums of Bob Dylan's work. But Odetta, great American, great artist in the civil rights movement of the 60s too. I think also one of her and Belafonte both played on the March in Washington with Martin Luther King as well.
And I'm pretty sure, I won't dig for it now because I already kind of ducked off camera to grab those Belafontes, but I have a Belafonte where he's got Odetta as sort of a guest on the album as well. And I think it might be the second of that Carnegie Hall that's the first album, and then he's.
And she's a unique voice to some people. And if you haven't heard Odetta, the people out there watching, check her out because she has a really bold, theatrical, almost operatic voice and flow.
Yes,
it's not beautiful. The traditional, I'm going around or even a Joni Mitchell or
right.
But it's really beautiful. But it for some people, it's an acquired taste of listeners now because she really projects out there. I happen to like that. I think it's a wonderful style and it's a very unique style. But she belts it out almost like there's a lot of gospel in her, like a Mahalia Jackson a little bit.
Too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Kind of the opposite of somebody like Elizabeth Cotton, who was kind of more subdued and more quiet.
Really low key. Exactly.
Yeah.
Her and the guitar, she sounds like a child almost.
Yes, yeah.
Which I
almost
love.
A whispering way of singing.
Absolutely. But I really like that bold, again, I love gospel music a lot. And I like, I'm not a religious person by any stretch of imagination, culturally Jewish, but I love gospel Christian music in that sense of it.
Right.
And I have this great collection called Testify, which is a 3 CD box that Rhino put out. Just an amazing box of classics of the 60s and 70s.
Does that have Sister Rosetta Tharpe on it?
While you're pulling your next one, I'll see.
Okay. Because she's fantastic. And of course, the grandmother of rock and roll guitar.
I do have Sister, I have her and other things. This is the box.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think I've seen that out there, actually. Yeah.
You're talking, I'll look and see. I don't know if she's on here.
So kind of the next sort of group of artists were the artists that were sort of coming up or used the sort of the blues end of the folk festivals to really sort of as their launching pad or as a stepping stone into the limelight. And one of them, talking about Dylan, is John Hammond Jr., technically, John Hammond II. An outstanding ambassador of the blues, a huge proponent of the blues, and somebody who really took the blues seriously, not only because of who his dad was, and it's basically in his blood or in his DNA, but just a deep respect for the message of the music. A very gifted guitar player. Sorry about the glare, it's kind of tough. Very gifted guitar player, harmonica player, and he has written quite a few original compositions and recorded them, but he's kind of more well known for covering Robert Johnson, Jerry Reed, John Lee Hooker, those sorts of guys, and really paying a lot of homage to those guys. And
he doesn't really sound very white, does he?
no, he's, and it's funny because he's from the northern part of the U.S., but he sounds like he's from the South. And again, I think it's just because it's in his blood, and his whole life through his dad was just John Hammond Sr. Obviously was just exposed to this music all the time, and just as a result, you know,
We should mention about John Hammond Sr. for people who don't know. He was probably one of the greatest A&R men ever at a label. He was at Columbia Records in the 50s and the 60s. He signed Bob Dylan. He signed Leonard Cohen. He signed Bruce Springsteen. He signed, going back, blues jazz artists.
right.
There's a whole list. You got to look it up. But an amazing auteur, record producer, but A&R. And if you don't know A&R, it's artist and repertoire. It's basically a person at a label, usually, who signs an artist, who helps develop them. Sometimes
kind of helps them to find their thing.
Yeah, brings in, maybe edits their material. It depends on the artist, obviously. Some artists want and deserve and pull in more creative output. Sometimes you need this person to develop you. It can go haywire, as we know with some production people, overproducing artists, especially later in the 60s into the 70s. But John Hammond is someone, a musicologist in essence too, that you should all know about.
Yeah, and he organized the From Spirituals to Swing concert at Carnegie Hall as well. Yeah, he was looking for Robert Johnson. Found out Robert Johnson died, so he brought in Big Bill Broonzy as a replacement. But he played some Robert Johnson 78s at the concert as well. But along with John Hammond, these sort of new up-and-comer guys, another one was Taj Mahal. And I know you're very familiar and a fan of
I've seen Taj Mahal many times. For a while, I used to be around the Bay Area a lot in the 70s a lot.
Yeah.
The first thing that got me in was that his album, the double album, not Natural Blues, Old Folks at Home, and it's a 2-record set with the blue cover, him standing there on Columbia. And I remember buying it because in those days, Columbia and some labels would have certain double records, only 50 cents more than a single. So a lot of us would buy it because you get double record.
Yeah, you get twice the music for, you know.
And then she caught the Katie, that album. I think it was before that. I don't know if it was his first or second album. And of course, he was starting a band with Ry Cooder early on.
Yeah, the Rising Sons.
Right?
Yeah,
which never was put out at the time until years later.
Yeah, yeah. And his song "Leaving Trunk" is great, and "Going Up to the Country, Paint My Mailbox Blue." But he also covered a lot of the earlier, sort of the 1930s and pre-war blues stuff. And again, it was another sort of ambassador, or really paid his respects. And I saw an interview with him. I can't remember. I think it was on one of the Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues PBS specials that eventually came out on video that I bought the set. And he's talking about when he would do these festivals, when he was finished his set, he'd go and hang out with the older blues cats like Mississippi John Hurt and just sit and talk to them and pick their brains, because he respected the music and the art form so much that he wanted to get a lot deeper. He wanted to do a deep dive into the music that they were playing, where they were coming from during their heyday. So
pretty much all his Columbia records are worth owning and picking up. The later ones, he starts getting into different sounds, like Caribbean sounds in mid to later 70s. And they're very good. I particularly like his earlier, late from 68, 69, when he was first on Columbia, through about 75. But I still like the later stuff. And then, of course, stuff he did on independent labels. He actually did a little acting. There's a great movie called Sounder that he was Sounder, Sounder, about slavery in the 70s with Cicely Tyson, who was married to Miles Davis. The soundtrack. So that's a good soundtrack. Yellow cover. That's a good one to pick up. So
not familiar with that.
going back a little bit to John Hammond, he produced some of the tracks on this, and I'd be remiss to talk about the folk scene in the 50s and the 60s without talking about Pete Seeger. We mentioned him a little earlier. This is a double comp, this is a good overview. There's also an amazing single Columbia overview of Pete Seeger. He started out in the early 50s, I don't know if it's late 40s, early 50s, as a trio, the Weavers. And the Weavers were, anti-war. He also was blacklisted and was put on those things. Did a series of a great record on how to play the banjo. Obviously very political songs, like he covered the song that a lot of people know that was his signature song, even though he didn't write it, was "We Shall Overcome." He was one of the white folk singers again, because a lot of the obviously black blues folk singers were doing "We Shall Overcome," and "Where Have All the Flowers Gone." He's the one who took the book, the lyrics from the Bible, from the book of Ecclesiastes, put them to music, and it became the song "Turn, Turn, Turn," which, again, my generation knows and beyond from the Byrds covering that, turning it into folk rock, adding that great Rickenbacker 12 strings. And of course, Little Boxes, the Malvina Reynolds song about the little ticky-tacky homes just south of San Francisco in Daly City. Right. But again,
a hugely important guy too, really influential as well. Going all the way into the 60s and the British music scene with the whole skiffle scene. I mean, he was a huge influence on that whole thing too.
Absolutely. He just died, within 5 years, maybe even more recently. Just had a centennial this past year. I believe it would have been 100 years old. Very important figure. And it's funny to watch, and I'll talk about it a little later here, but the Newport Folk Festival, he was on the board and organization of that every year on the East Coast. And the year Dylan goes electric, and even his reaction, if you look at him, is not too happy about what.
Not too amused.
1965 of that year.
Yeah. And he did a lot of stuff with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee as well.
Yeah. I love. I didn't. Do you have any Sonny Terry here? No,
I do, but I didn't pull any, oddly enough, because I thought perhaps you might. But
I didn't.
I want to kind of touch on what you were talking about with Newport and going electric and Dylan, and again with these sort of new and up and coming guys, although they were already fairly well known in the Chicago area, was the Paul Butterfield Blues Band with Mike Bloomfield, and I don't have their first album because I'm kind of holding out for a really, really nice copy. But these guys were one of those guys that early on in the folk festival circuit went electric and ticked off a lot of people. And not as much as when Dylan went electric, of course, but just an outstanding band. This is one of their later versions of that band when later on when Elvin Bishop joined the band. But Paul Butterfield, another sort of a white bluesman from Chicago who's like really legit, it was just in his blood, and he respected the musical art form so much that he wanted to bring it not only to Chicago crowds but to the world. Yeah, there you go. East West, great album. Yeah, and that's Buster Crabshaw's great too. Yeah.
What's interesting about this is a time, it was a 67 or 68, 66. I forgot the years, maybe
I think East West is 66, 67.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it, which I didn't show any really electric blues stuff for this video, but you reminded me of this, and I love this stuff. And big fan of, obviously, of Mike Bloomfield, Elvin Bishop. I don't know if he's on this one, but
I think he's on the Buster Crabshaw.
Yeah. And the other guitarist that I love he's not on this either. Who played at Woodstock with him? I'm trying to get his name. Cristo Redendum, that record.
See, Elvin Bishop. He's not on this one either. So the name escapes me. But
Theory, Cristo Redendum blues album.
I couldn't find Cristo Redemptor Blues in your music.
Is he a guitar player?
Oh, Siri didn't like that.
He's a guitar player?
guitar player, that
Yeah.
Cristo Redendum album, whatever. Someone's going to write it here, or by the end of this, we'll remember it. But
Well, I know that Charlie Musselwhite did a version of that song on harmonica.
yeah,
Christo.
yeah, that's not who I'm thinking of. What's interesting
Oh.
about this East, especially the song East West, is how the Eastern, Middle Eastern Indian influence raga like guitar players in minor notes on that.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great album. That's the one that I'm holding out for.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. There was another guy that was an electric guy, an electric player that a lot of people assumed that he would play acoustic because he often recorded albums both. And he appeared at Newport was Muddy Waters. And he just made everybody go crazy at the Newport Festival. You know, he's one of those headliner guys that they would bring in to put asses in the seats, as I alluded to earlier. And, you know, this is the 1960 Muddy at Newport. And sort of the opposite, I guess, of Dylan, where a lot of people weren't too impressed that he went electric, you know, on the folk circuit. You know, Muddy just blew everybody's socks off and just wowed the crowd. And I think he had like 3 encores or something like that. I think he played and Got My Mojo Working twice. He just, you know, because it was, you know, the crowd was just losing their marbles over having this blues legend, you know.
I mean, as I mentioned before, yeah, as I mentioned before, the one also that crosses over into what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, is Folk Singer. That album, Muddy Waters.
Yeah.
Gorgeous record, beautiful recording. For those who are interested in the sound, the audio, but it's beautiful. Oh, Harvey Mandel. That's who I was thinking of.
Harvey Mandel. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I recognize the name now.
Yeah, he's on plays with the Butterfield Blues Band at Woodstock. He's there, a great guitar player, and that's a great kind of Eastern psychedelic record. I can't even pronounce it here because Maslov can't pronounce Cristo Redentor. Yeah, that is a perfect record. Everyone here who's watching, if aside from the later Muddy Waters electric stuff, that record, Folk Singer, Muddy Waters.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, you've got Willie Dixon on the slap bass, and you know, you've got Buddy Guy backing him up on acoustic 6-string, and then Muddy playing, you know, bottleneck style. Incredible, you know.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going totally West Coast folk white bread right now because it's important. And you get these records for 50 cents to $1, if that. You could probably get like 6 of their records for $1 now. That's the Kingston Trio. Now, Kingston Trio, I don't know if they're based in San Francisco. They came out of the West Coast. They were at a time in the late 50s, the biggest selling folk act. They did all the colleges when the folk scene was coming. Remember that whole thing, the beatnik scene with the guys with the little goatees, kind of like us, the two of us.
Yeah, but with berets instead.
Yeah, berets. Maynard G. Krebs from Dobie Gillis, if you know what I'm talking about. Their stuff was not controversial, was not political. They were humorous on stage. Their number one hit was an old recreation of the Hangman new song, Tom Dooley, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley.
Yes, I remember that track.
And then they did songs like Santo Anno, Scotch and Soda. So this sort of begat later in the 60s Peter, Paul, and Mary that did Dylan songs and did things. But it was that kind of, and I saying white bread sounds like I'm really dissonant, and I don't mean to. There's a lot, it became really popular. There are other groups like the Limelighters and a lot of these sort of, you know, 3 white guys with the harmonies, 3-part harmonies.
Yeah.
That were really good. In fact, you know, that Christopher Guest movie about the folk singers.
A Mighty Wind?
A Mighty Wind.
Yeah.
And, by the way.
That's a hilarious movie, by the way.
But by the way, Fred Willard, the actor who's in all those movies, just died today. And I just got a notice, and that's Fred Willard.
Oh, rest in peace, Fred. Yeah, hilarious guy. Really
I'm a big Christopher Guest fan. But what's great about that movie, A Mighty Wind, it almost, in a way, well, it's a mockumentary for one thing. It mocks this type of music, the 3 white guys being so overwrought, seriously doing things. But these are great records. I mean, they're kind of simple, upbeat. They're not
Well, it
dark.
made it really accessible, right? It
They're
made
very
it, like you said, it brought it to a huger audience because it had a sort of a poppy spin to it, you know?
It did, and it was
Yeah,
very simple. They're very well recorded. Capitol made a shitload of money on these. They put so many records out. That's why I don't pick it when I see a good cover and it's not overly played. Like this is a beautiful. This I believe this is the first album they did, a lovely mono version. But I don't have a lot of their record. I do have an anthology on CD, but I think it's an important thing to talk about the '60s folk scene from my point of view.
yeah,
An important part. Again, it came more from the West Coast sound, the coffee house, college thing around the country. It made it safe. They weren't banned on college campuses like some controversial folks singers.
right, right. And the nice thing about them being a smaller group or a smaller ensemble is they were able to do those 2, 3, or 4 part harmonies and do it very well, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas oftentimes you get somebody like, oh, I don't know, like Mississippi John Hurt up there by himself, and it's great, and the crowd loved him, but you don't get that sort of extra bump up that you get with, you know, a trio or a quartet or something like that,
Right.
where they can really incorporate a lot of the harmonies.
And unlike some of the maybe Greenwich Village and East Coast folk singers in the '60s, once the anti-war movement really started to get going, the civil rights movement, they weren't really about that. They were like the humor, did the shtick. You know,
Yeah,
also a lot of people don't know or maybe don't even remember the Smothers Brothers were a folk duo, and they were
yes,
playing the clubs in New York and San Francisco, the Hungry Eye, the Purple Onion. Those were clubs in North Beach, San Francisco
mhm,
during this sort of beat period time when Ferlinghetti opened up City Lights Books and the whole beat generation was happening. And they were kind of the safer ones. They did their comedy shtick, you know, the
right,
dumb
yeah.
brother and the smart brother. But if you listen to their singing and their songs, like Tom Dooley and those, they were pretty really good. I didn't pull them, but okay.
Yeah.
Chris?
I just want to, just a couple of last ones to show here. Again, they're more of the sort of the headliners, the guys that were, as you went from the 50s into the 60s, who already had a great career. And these were the sort of the guys that they really would push up front to draw the crowds in and to try to, you know, sell more tickets at the gate because they had already had really, really long, extensive careers. Both of these guys going back to the 1940s in terms of not only recording careers, but performing in blues clubs and juke joints, whether it was in the city or in the country. And one of them, of course, is Lightnin Hopkins.
Oh, love that record.
Just, I mean, this is a reissue, excuse the glare, but he was one of those guys, again, that fit perfectly into that folk slash blues revival because he's very country, very folky sounding, but he was a straight up bluesman. Lots of bending, just even his vocal style in that Texas blues tradition was very strong, straight ahead blues guy. But because he, whether he played electric or played acoustic, had that sort of folky sort of vibe to him. You know, he would just again put a lot of asses in the seats and very approachable. Again, very comforting, very comfortable style of music. And, you know, and again, because in the 50s and 60s, country music itself was starting to come up, you know, he could sort of blend, you know, 2 or 3 of those genres together. And he did it really, really well. And a really cool voice, too, you know, didn't hide his Texas twang at all. He, in fact, probably played it up a little bit to make him seem more, you know, approachable, more folksy, more down to earth. But just absolutely
Love that
outstanding.
record. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a great record.
You know, I don't have a lot of women here, but I had to show one, and not just to show one, but I think Joan Baez is very important in
Oh,
the
yeah, for
'60s
sure.
New York scene. Obviously, she befriended and was involved with Bob Dylan for a while, but really helped him start getting gigs and on some of the bills at the early clubs and, you know, Gertie's Folk City and Greenwich Village and some of the other clubs. They
Right.
sang together, and she really championed him. And I love their singing together. There's some live albums and some live recordings, and you know, people have a love hate with Dylan. Some people, I'm a big fan. I'm virtually a completist when it comes to Bob Dylan. But
Right.
Joan Baez was on Vanguard, started selling a lot of records. Later, she did a great record called Any Day Now. That wasn't until 1968, which is a double cover album recorded in Nashville of all Dylan songs. And it's a
Mm.
great version of Dylan songs. But this is her debut on Vanguard. got a lot of things like House of the Rising Sun. John Riley again. I could do a whole CD comp on just John Riley from the Byrds to
Right, yeah.
to
Well,
all
House of the Rising Sun, Leadbelly did in the I think,
exactly.
40s too.
Again, my generation,
30s.
we learned it because of the Animals, Eric Burton, the Animals,
Yeah,
doing
of course.
Fare Ye Well. So a lot of these songs, you could pick 10 folk albums from early 60s and you'd find the same 2 or 3 songs on almost all of them. So I wanted to show that. At the same time in the Village, just before I go to, I have a couple too after this, but I do want to also mention Dave Van Ronk, because Dave Van Ronk was a mix of blues, folk, a little bit of a curmudgeon. They called him the mayor of McDougal Street. He really kind of also helped artists like Dylan and Phil Ochs and the others really looked up to him. He was actually for a moment, a blink of a moment, considered to be in what became Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Okay.
But if you ever seen the film, and I suggested, some people didn't like it, but the Coen Brothers film, Inside Llewellyn Davis. It's about a folk singer in Greenwich Village in the 60s, and it basically parallels, the character is based somewhat loosely on Dave Van Ronk.
Okay, yeah.
If you should watch that movie.
I'll like check it out. I'm going to look for it.
Inside Llewellyn Cohen. Dave Van Ronk did a great version of another song that was covered by a lot of these artists. There's Cocaine. I believe, was it Buffy St. Marie might have written that song. Motherless Children, Samson and Delilah, Hang Me on Hang Me. So again, all the same type of songs. But Dave Van Ronk's, again, a very important figure of the New York folk scene in the early 60s.
Well, you were talking about Joan Baez, kind of palling around with Dylan. And I know that she really helped out quite a bit with John Hammond Jr. and also with, what's his name? The name escapes me. But they all sort of came up around the same time. And, it's that cat's name now. The name is escaping me.
Folk singer?
Drive me nuts. What's that?
Folk singer?
Kind of traditional blues, jazz kind of guy. Ain't misbehaving, saving all my love for you.
The thing who just died last year?
Yeah.
With the cartoon cover.
The Mysterious Man of Mystery.
You and I both did tribute videos to him.
Yeah, and now we can't. I'll wake up at 3 a.m. screaming out his name because it'll suddenly come to me in a dream or something. But yeah, they all sort of hung around in the same circles and sort of in New York, and around the same time, it sort of really helped to bolster each other.
I found this on the web.
I can't remember.
I've got it down here somewhere. I just hate to lean down and dig for it.
Oh shit! Yeah. Anyway, we'll get to it. Do you have another one?
Yeah, I have one last one, and again, it was another sort of a big. Leon Redbone. That's his name.
Of course.
Leon Redbone. Oh, I feel better now. But the last sort of headliner guy. He was probably, maybe aside from Muddy Waters, was kind of the biggest guy that really did a lot of the folk festival and blues festivals. And when he would do the blues festivals, he would go electric. But often when he would do the folk circuit of these festivals in the 50s and in the 60s, he would do a lot of acoustic stuff, and that's John Lee Hooker.
Oh yeah.
And he was already a huge star and had already been recording for, 30 years plus by the time the 60s came around, and had done hundreds of sides before he even started recording albums in the 50s and 60s. But just, again, one of those guys that really could captivate the crowd, whether he was going crazy and going electric and doing like Boom Boom or Boogie Chillin', or whether he was doing his sort of more of the slower, sort of lamenting, sadder blues by himself, like Hobo Blues. And
he had a club in San Francisco. It's still there, called the Boom Boom Room. And it's right across Geary Boulevard from where the Fillmore Auditorium is. And one of the highlights of my musical life was one of the photographers I represent did a photo shoot with him. And I spent the day with him and his protege who kind of drives him around, because he lived down the peninsula from San Francisco, and he came to the photo shoot just before lunch. And of course, this is going to sound cliche, and I ordered lunch, and we said, "What do you want for lunch? We're going to order out." We take him for a photo shoot because he has to sit around all afternoon, and of course he wanted barbecue. So I
Yeah,
ordered out barbecue ribs from Big Nate's of Nate Thurman, the basketball player, at a rib joint near the studio. But he was so great. But then he was, pretty old. This was in the, I'd say, late '80s.
okay, yeah. So
I
he
don't know.
was already into his 70s at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So of course, anyway, it was just great talking about music, and he was really sweet, and he just hung out, and he, unfortunately, he didn't have to bring his guitar. I thought he was going to, play. Maybe he
yeah,
had a guitar in the photo. I don't remember now, but it wasn't like I thought he'd do a few little full tunes, but that was really a cool thing. Big
yeah.
fan.
He was one of the greatest. And the funny thing, much like I was talking sort of in threes with these folk revivals and the blues guys that sort of came up, was he sort of had three different careers too. He had his initial big recording career, basically, with Boogie Chillin' and Dimples, and then he sort of fell out, and then came back up in the '60s for the folk and blues revivals, and then sort of fell out again. And then in the '80s, he started doing a lot of these collaborations and doing
Like Van
duets with
Morrison.
Bonnie Raitt and Van Morrison, and he sort of shot up again. And he was on a high when he passed, thank
Yeah.
goodness, which was great. Yeah.
I'm going to close out with two artists, and I think are the yin yang, and one obviously everybody knows, and I could, again, I had to mention Bob Dylan, and I have to mention Phil Ochs, who's a personal favorite of mine. Phil Ochs is the golden voice of the folk scene. He's got this perfect pitch voice, very beautiful, in a lot of ways too beautiful for a lot of people in the folk world. I don't think people wanted uh, voices that perfect. When Dylan stopped doing his protest songs, he really continued. And
Okay.
I Ain't Marching Anymore is one of his first ones on this album, very into the peace movement.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, he died way too young. He hung himself when he was in his 30s, I believe, late 30s. I forget what exactly. One of my all-time favorite songs is not a folk album, but is the album he did later. It's like more of a conceptual album. And again, I'm just blanking. Pleasure of the Harbor, to me,
Okay.
is a
Okay.
gorgeous record. Very orchestrated and piano by a piano player by the name of Lincoln Mallorca. There's also the story of, at one point, they had a rivalry in a way, which is a weird, strange thing anyway.
Yeah.
Supposedly,
Especially for some peace-loving folkies.
yeah, supposedly Dylan kicked him out of his limo, but I don't know. That seems like folklore more than anything else, because he
Yeah.
never quite made it on the same level as Dylan. Although I have all his Electra records and A&M records, and I'm a completist when it comes to Phil Ochs. I absolutely love him. In terms of Dylan, I could have picked a ton of Dylan albums. I picked this, and this is maybe late into this time, but this is 1966. It's fun, and this is from the bootleg series. And they called this, when it came out as a bootleg years ago, before all Dylan did his archival material, his own bootleg series. It came
Okay.
out called the Royal Albert Hall Recordings, 1966. Well, it's not recorded at the Royal Albert Hall, and it was recorded in Birmingham, England, actually. So that's
Oh, okay.
why when you see it now, it's got quotes or over Royal Albert Hall. But he does two sets here, and this is '66. Remember, so this is the year after he did the infamous Newport Going Electric show. I'm
Right.
showing this because to me this is the bridge of the end of, at least for Bob Dylan, of the folks scene. Although subsequent years he still played acoustic guitar, never really quit.
Yeah. Right.
On electric in obviously '65 and Highway 61, and then Blonde on Blonde in '66. The first set is him and acoustic guitar doing, She Belongs to Me, Visions of Johanna, it's all over now, Baby Blue, Desolation Row. It's one of the most beautiful recordings sound-wise. I suggest anybody who wants any one of the bootleg series, any one great recording, that traditional Bob Dylan voice that you like, maybe if you like Dylan, Dylan went through all these voices, and some people can't stand the new Dylan. I like it, but it's not.
Right. Yeah.
This is the cliche perfect Dylan. And I mean what cliche with all due respect. The first set was all acoustic. The second set, he comes on with the Hawks backing him up. The Hawks would become the band.
Right.
And
Yes. Yeah.
all electric. And this is the famous concert where you hear someone yell out, "You Judas," because he went electric.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember
And
hearing about
that's
that.
it was on bootlegs for years, and it's on this stupendous recording. I don't know if the vinyl is still available. It's a box set. It's a double record, I believe, 2 records. But even with the compact disc version, this to me is probably the best live Dylan album that anyone can own. So I'm going to end my segment showing this Bob Dylan from the folk 60s, and with Chris, the blues 60s. Any last words, Chris?
No, well, okay, yeah. Just again, I want to thank you very much for reaching out and taking the time to do this with me, and of course for all of these that you've been doing with everybody. They've been fascinating and a lot of fun. A lot of them are really engaging, really funny, really entertaining, and
This was
learning
not
a
funny
lot.
at all. I didn't
As we all love
enjoy
to sort of learn from each other here in the BC. So yeah, cheers to you.
couldn't be
man.
funny with this one for some reason.
What's that?
I wasn't funny with this one. I can't be funny with this one. But also, what I try to do whenever I've reached out, I ask for other people's ideas, and every once in a while, I come up with an idea that I watch you a lot, and I want something that suits what you do. And I
Right.
don't want to do like you and I. Let's do one on our favorite 10 disco records. I don't think that would be interesting. We'd
No,
probably
because I don't own any.
right,
I don't
exactly.
own a single one.
Yeah, it would be a bad.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you all in the vinyl community and everybody's watching this. Check
Yes,
out
thank
these
you.
records. One thing I remiss that I don't do, and I've had a few people comment on this series of videos, they want me to list the records in the comment section that we showed. And I should really do that for archival purposes, but I just never do.
Yeah, that's tough.
If anybody wants to do that and put them in there, I'll love you forever. Here we go. Anyway, VC, Mazzy loves you. I don't know if Chris does, but maybe he
I
does.
do. I like all of you very, very much.
Yes. And from North America, we say adieu.
And we say, have a good day, eh?
Okay.